Doctors of Reddit, what is your how the hell are you even alive right now? Story? It's a toss-up between the guy who shot himself in the neck with a crossbow bolt and somehow missed his carotid arteries and jugular vein, or this old guy with dementia who fell down the stairs, broke his neck and his hip, and was still walking around R&D screaming, "Why does it hurt when I walk?" Last year, on Boxing Day, during the first few weeks of my rotation on R&D as in Fight 2. The day started quiet, which was apparently unusual for Boxing Day. Nothing major came in until around midday, when suddenly, I hear shouts for help. An unconscious little girl is rushed in, surrounded by a couple paramedics performing CPR. Within seconds there are literally dozens of doctors and nurses around this 6-year-old girl that is blue like a smurf. Apparently she had fallen into a freezing pond. We have a saying that a patient isn't dead till they are warm and dead, so CPR was ongoing. We were using anything and everything to warm her up, including warming her blood and even pumping warm saline into her abdomen. 7 hours of CPR, and one of the best consultants I have ever had the pleasure of working with, and the girl somehow survived. Even more shocking, she had survived with no brain or organ damage. I can barely believe it, and I was there. Med student now, but during undergrad, when I was volunteering at the local emergency department, we had a guy and his buddy come in. He was very pale, and they both looked incredibly worried. The triage nurse took one look at the guy, freaked out, and sent him back immediately. They were both out for wheeling, and the guy had flipped his onto a stump and impaled himself through the belly. He managed to break part of the stump off, so his buddy could drive him to the ED, still impaled. Usually the very sick people come into the ED on an ambulance, and this guy just walked in the front door like no big deal. I had an older fellow just last month who fell off a roof, got up, drove about 12 kilometers home on a bumpy forest road, took a shower, and his wife made him come to the ER because he was a little short of breath. He had a flailed chest, dangerous number of rib fractures, blood around his heart and lungs, oh yeah, and something called a hangman's fracture in his neck. Drove on a bumpy road, took a shower, hangman's fracture, wow. Man walks into our emergency department. Few scratches on the left side of his face, singed eyebrows, bit of a limp. What happened to you? Put my car in a ditch. So this happens a lot. People crash ET cars and figure they should probably get checked over, so they come to R&D and they are largely fine. This guy, however, left out some important details. Firstly, he'd been driving a 1999 Toyota something or other at about 95 miles per hour. Secondly, he hadn't been wearing a seatbelt. Thirdly, the reason his car left the road was because it had caught fire. Fourthly, he was elected through the windscreen and into a tree. On closer inspection, he had brush and undergrowth stuck in his hair, teeth, and nose, not to mention itty little bits all over his clothes. Fifthly, he had been unconscious for an hour or so. He knew this because he had just checked the time prior to leaving the road and had checked again when he regained consciousness. Since he'd been in the middle of nowhere, he had had to walk something like 6 miles to get to the hospital. Why on earth didn't you call an ambulance? Didn't really think I needed one. Full trauma protocol, and several scans later, and he had a small bleed inside his head, 3 busted vertebrae, 1 in the neck, 2 in the chest, a small bleed on his spleen which had just so happened to stop, and a broken wrist. Seriously shouldn't be here. Just lucky. Alright, here's a crazy one. The patient originally came in 4 hours prior because she was having an active heart attack. The patient is transferred to the cardiovascular ICU and a cardiologist is called in to do a cath to see what further treatment may need to be done for the heart. During the cath, it's discovered that the patient is having an abdominal aortic dissection. This is basically when the patient has a tear in the aorta and they are internally bleeding at a rapid pace. Shortly after the dissection is discovered and the surgeon is called, the patient codes. Patient goes into VFib, breathing stops. She coded for about a minute and was shocked back into a rhythm relatively quickly. The patient was fully alert minutes after the shock, and the ER doc who was called down to work the code was communicating that she needed to be intubated and the surgeon was on his way to treat her. Long story short, the patient made it. That's one of the rare cases where the initial heart attack landed her in the right place at the right time, ultimately ended up saving her life. I'm not a doctor but. Just kidding. Yes I am. I just wanted to fit in. Honestly it was a guy who showed up to her because he fell and broke his arm. Simple right? He also had a cough he couldn't kick. That's the only issues he had in his mind. Look at the guy for 1 second and it's a whole new story. He was covered in skin cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, maybe 400 separate spots. Clearly HIV+. We checked his blood, CD4 of ducking 6, normal 1200+, under 200 definitely immunocompromised. Super thin and frail guy, but he says he's always been thin. But man this guy is sick. So we give him a chest x-ray. Can barely see his lungs. They are covered by massive amounts of bacteria. In his case, tuberculosis, cake topper, diabetes, uncontrolled, with severe kidney problems, and also about a quarter as much hemoglobin as he should have. The list just goes on and on with him. So that's the most sick I've seen someone, I think. We did what we could with chest tube, antibiotics, other medication, HIV meds, and intensive care unit eventually. The guy died 6 days after showing up. It's a story about me, with my dad being the doctor, and him not knowing Reddit right now. I was 20 years old, 2 years ago, when my dad first took some blood, because I looked quite yellow in the face. Iron shortage he thought. I got a phone call from my dad, when I was with a friend out drinking in my college city. He said I'm coming for you right now, pack a bag. You're not going back studying anytime soon. The blood test showed that my hemoglobin values were so low, a 4. 5. A normal man should have around 14. I don't know the exact scale or anything. They took some pictures of my body and full examination the same night. The conclusion was I had one overgrown kidney working for roughly 6% and my other one the size of a peanut hardly working at all. Doctors there said I could fallen into a coma at any time with all this stuff happening to me. Still load of drinking at college etc. Close bracket. They were even surprised at how I was still doing everything from sporting to going to classes all day, since with a serious blood shortage I should been sleeping 14 hours a day to function like a normal person for the rest of the day. Now 2 years later, I've had a renal transplant and finally got off of dialysis. However you write it, I'm not from an English speaking country, and my dad still blames himself for not noticing anything in the years prior to the discovery, since it was most likely something that I had since birth and never got noticed. When I'm actually truly grateful that he drew some blood that day and made my life better. Oh yes, I got his kidney now. Not a doctor, but when I was 12 I was sideswiped by a drunk driver at about 100. EMTs and cops on scene said they have seen similar accidents and just assumed I was dead. One officer said duck it and checked my pulse, very faint but it was there. Got life flighted to the children's came close to flatlining. Almost every bone in my body was broke, massive amounts of internal bleeding. 3-month coma, screws and pins all over my legs. Had to relearn everything. While in the coma they told my dad if I didn't come out after 4 months that was it. Took me another year to walk again. Lost a testicle. Told me I couldn't have kids. I have a 1-year-old boy now. Tons of mental and physical issues, but for the most part I'm actually healthy. After the coma and the condition I was in, doctors gave me a year to live. Said I probably wouldn't even make that with my brain all ducked up. Not only did I make that, I'm close to my 10-year anniversary and I have to say other than a UN filling hunger I'm okay. Coming into the hospital they gave me a week, then as time went on they varied my time. Edit. Thanks so much for the gold. It brings me tears to know that people care enough to actually read my story. Open bracket colon. I'm not a doctor but this is my story. I was working in Joplin MO when a tornado hit in May 2011. When I got out of the wreckage I saw a large metal pipe, about 4 inches in diameter sticking through the windshield of a red truck. I went over to check on the car and there was a small girl in the front seat. The pipe had completely punched through center of her body. I have a little medical training from my old job and started to do what I could. Just the basics of keeping her calm, high heart rate equals fast bleed out, awake, and applying a BVM I kept in my now destroyed car. Grandma was a nurse and gave it to me for an emergency. There were no cell phone towers left. I couldn't call 911 and report my location, so it took about 30 minutes for the professionals to get on scene. They managed to cut the seat out of the car, break the pipe at the ends, and transported both the girl and seat to the hospital. She lived and is doing well for the most part, considering the seriousness of the injuries. The pipe came in at a slight angle and missed her spine, which was very fortunate. Not a doctor, however, my father had somewhat of an odd incident 1 year ago. Choked on a biscuit while driving, passed out, went into opposite lane traffic, took out a barbed wire fence, telephone pole, bobcat, and a parked car, ripping his entire front axle out of his car, and they said the steering wheel hitting his chest from the accident must have performed the Heimlich maneuver and saved his life. Walked away with a chipped tooth and a totaled car. That's it. The EMTs were confused as duck. I was an MD at a VA hospital and working with veterans. I've got 1,000 of these stories because seriously, nothing can kill a veteran. Anyone who works at a VA can confirm. Here's my best one. Vietnam vet on a scout mission. When he and his 2 buddies take gunfire, he takes 2 bullets. One to his left thigh. Second bullet goes through the front of his helmet, grazes the right side of his head, down to but not through the bone. Because it went through the front of the helmet, the bullet doesn't have the velocity to exit the back of the helmet. Instead, it bounces off the inside of the helmet, ricochets down and to the left, and then passes through his neck within 1 inch of his brainstem and cervical spine. It continues into his chest, somehow missing major arteries including his aorta and pulmonary vessels, goes completely through his left lung, and gets stopped by one of his ribs. He's carried back by his buddies, who drop him several times in the thick jungle. Multiple surgeries, necrotizing fasciitis of leg wound, spends a month in a full body cast, 3 more months in rehab. Years later he complained that his left ribs hurt when he sits back against a hard chair. Surgeon finds bullet lodged under his rib, takes it out, problem solved. As he tells me this story, he pulls his wallet out and shows me the bullet. BAMF. I have way too many of these stories. Working in a major trauma center, one guy had a hypoglycemic attack while driving, lost consciousness, drove through the barrier of the road, rolled down a hill, landed upside down on a railroad track, got hit by a freight train carrying coal which then came to a sudden stop, which caused the coal it was carrying to fall onto the car. Guy self-extricated and crawled out of the car. Ended up with a few fractured vertebrae and other bones. No major injuries. Discharged in a few days. Funny thing is the event was published on the local news website while he was still in the Resus Bay, and I used that information to write up his history in the clinical notes because he was zonked out with painkillers. Another guy did a wheelie on his motorbike and crashed. Broke his spine. Became a paraplegic, fractured clavicle and humerus, multiple rib fractures, punctured both lungs. Next day, chest tubes caused bleeding in the chest requiring thoracic surgery. Developed blockage of his bowels and needed a tube into the rear end. Spent a few weeks in ICU and HDU and was almost ready for rehab, then developed a lung infection and had fluid around his heart. Needed removal of some of the dead infected lung tissue and drainage of the heart sac, and went straight back to ICU. Will get buried, but has to be said. Years ago my uncle was out working in the field, farmer, and somehow his sleeve got caught in a grain grinder. It began pulling in his arm, got to about mid-forearm, when he was finally able to cut the broken and shredded arm free. He wrapped his arm, walked to his truck, drove home, and told his wife he likely had to go to the hospital. Not a doctor, a veteran. Had the doctor say that phrase to my face. Was in Iraq and had a BID, vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, run through 2 Iraqi checkpoints taking gunfire, obviously heading straight for the Iraqi police force ERB training volunteers meal formation area. About 600 Iraqi volunteers and 2 to 3 dozen coalition trainers formed up for meals, generally without weapons. Swung my gun truck around to intercept, and as we moved in the machine gun jammed, so pulling my driver inside. Running out of time I told my driver to ram him. 3 lives or 600, no thought needed to the decision. We hit hard enough that it ripped the bolt holding my seat belt out of the frame and sent me flying into the windshield hard enough to crack the ballistic glass and crush my helmet. Medic apparently declared me dead on the scene. But I woke up a minute later and got up. Obviously got sent to medical for evaluation, and upon hearing the damage done and looking at my helmet, the doctor looked at me and said, "How the hell are you even alive right now?" Not death defying or anything, but I did once get asked by a doctor how I was still walking. Pad is day 2010. Barefoot in the street at 3 AM. Not smart. Stand on broken bottle. Glass shatters under and into my foot. I figure I can sleep it off. Get my flatmate to rent me some crutches. Foot heals. I go overseas. Backpacking. Hiking. A year later I finally get my foot scanned, and it looks like a picture of the night sky. My foot's full of sparkling shards of glass. Had surgery where I imagine they just hollowed out my foot with an ice cream scoop. I now legit have one of those old it hurts in the cold wounds.